Nodes are the boss of the network. Bosses have employees, and you can have good employees that can read between the lines and do things that aren't explicitly laid out in their contracts, or you can have bad employees that want to use your own words against you and do stuff that makes your life harder just so they can turn around and point to the wording in the contract and go, see, I did what I was told. The latter is called working to rule, and there's an allegory around it that's supposed to have occurred in Soviet era Russia. It's not a real story, but like all fiction, it points to reality and teaches us more about reality than something that actually happened ever could. That's the purpose of allegory. It was a nail factory where the workers were supposed to produce 16 tons of nails every year. So they make one giant 16-ton nail and then do nothing for the rest of the year. And then this is the point, right? Because what you have here is a lack of communication that is being exploited by people that want to deliberately be recalcitrant and annoying. Obviously, there's no use to a 16-ton nail. When we talk about 16 tons of nails, the assumption would be that you get them, this long, that long, that long, and you divide them up as necessary, and then you're actually doing your job. But you can point to your contract and say, see, I did it. That's the nature of the conversation and the assumption of the relationship miners and nodes have with one another at the moment. It never used to be, and it doesn't need to be that hostile. And this has gone back all the way to the beginning of the spam debate, because people are always saying, you guys are trying to say that miners should do what's good for Bitcoin. Good luck with that. They're only going to do what makes them money, and it's only going to be short-term incentives that they really care about. Now, I despise talking in the abstract with something of this nature because we don't have miners. We have 7 companies. That's it. We basically only have 2 that are responsible for what goes on in the blockchain. And as a result of that, they need to be good stewards of the protocol. And if they're doing stuff that's consensus valid, that's harming the protocol, then we get to turn around to them and say, you guys aren't doing what I want you to do. I don't care what's written in the contract. If you're filling up the chain with absolute crap and undermining the whole use of Bitcoin as a monetary network, I don't care what the consensus rules say. You need to listen to what the actual users of the network say. Now, I'm going to be very clear here. The miners aren't doing anything wrong yet because they haven't had anything put in place which states the intentions of the people in a more subtle capacity than what the contract or the consensus rules say. So if you get a brand new bunch of employees and they don't understand and they genuinely do go into it and say, all right, we made one giant 16-ton nail. Is that not what you meant? That can happen, right? And there's communication involved and there's guidance. But when you start iterating on these things and you start improving and your relationship with your employees and between your employer and your employees, when you start improving that, people have to be willing to work together to try and communicate what each other need. Because you have a human with a desire, you have human that's going to implement it. Then you have communication, which is a lossy algorithm by which they can negotiate and figure out what each other really mean. We know that however I write it down is not going to be however you perceive it, right? Okay, so we're talking about a computer protocol, so things get a lot more well-defined than that. But consensus is still really, really loose. It has to be. We can't define monetary usage of Bitcoin with something as black and white as a contract or the protocol equivalent, which is, defining what is and is consensus valid, is and is not consensus valid. But this is the frustrating part of the spam conversation because so many people go, we are sick of this, just fork, change the consensus rules, or go away and stop complaining about it. Everyone is saying that is bored of this debate. People that are just sitting on the sidelines don't want to talk about it anymore. And they completely don't understand the nature of what the network is. The miners are the employees of the network, and the nodes are the bosses. And the nodes do not have the capacity, because it doesn't exist, for them to define exactly what it is they want miners to do. They have to have something ephemeral, something far more flexible that they can use to say, all right, here's roughly what we want. We want a monetary network. We're going to relay around monetary activity, and we expect you to put that in the chain. And anything that defies that purpose, we are going to tell you isn't something we want in the chain, and we don't want to have to rewrite the contract every time something weird comes up. We just want you to figure out what we want and to take your cue from us and to adapt accordingly. That's what happens with mempool policies, because mempool policies can change quite flexibly and they can indicate fairly well to miners, hey, you're not receiving any of this stuff. It's not okay for you to start soliciting it out of band like Mara does and dumping this crap in the chain. We don't want it, and we're telling you that for very good reason. And there's no reason to presume in the current environment that miners, apart from Mara, who are obviously bad actors, that other miners would actually not respect that. And everyone wants to act like Bitcoin's hyper adversarial and everyone is slitting everyone else's throats to become as reliable as possible, or to look out for their own interests, and everyone is allergic to the word altruism. But that is not reality, because miners are not an abstract that you can point to and basically dismiss them all as a dumb profit maximizing algorithm. They're people who are trying to work with other people, and more to the point, there's not even a dozen of them. There's about 7. You have Foundry, you have Antpool. That's already over 51% of the network at that point anyway. Those guys can attack and destroy Bitcoin if they want. Saying they're not incentivized to do that is meaningless. If they did it, we would come after them. And they can be put in a position where they're forced to do it because they're so big that someone can hold a gun to their head and make them work against their own interests, right? If a pool does something we hate, like Mara did with OFAC compliance, back then we weren't worried about whether that was financially incentivized or not, or economically rational for Mara to do such a thing. We told them, stop it. We are relaying this stuff around the network because it's monetary activity and you're excluding it from your blocks because the government says it's bad. We are not all right with that. We kicked off about it and they stopped doing it. No one sat around playing philosophical games saying, oh, but it's up to a miner what they want to include and what they don't want to include. They're only going to do what's economically rational for them. If it's economically advantageous to be OFAC censoring versus a miner that doesn't and is embroiled in lawsuits all the time, then they just have to do what is economically rational for them. That bullshit never happened with that conversation. We just said, get out of here. We don't approve of that. Stop it. Now you have the flip side, of course, which is why we can still say Mara's a bad actor. We invoke exactly the same reasoning and we flip it on its head. It's the flip side of the same coin. They're not excluding stuff because of government blacklists. They're including stuff that we are, well, I'll explain more in a minute, but actually Mara, specifically with Slipstream, is doing the very worst thing at the moment. The employer class of the entire network is hiring a security guard, which is what Mara is in their capacity as a Bitcoin miner, and that employee is deliberately looking at the rules of the contract and saying, I can get away with this. I found a bunch of holes. I can do stuff that my employers obviously don't like, which is force them to spend more money storing crap that makes me a bit more, and I can get away with it because it's not explicitly in the contract. Employees that do that get fired, okay? And that doesn't mean doing a hard fork or something of that nature right away. It means having a conversation and saying, you guys need to stop doing this, which is reasonable to do in an environment where you don't have 1 billion miners. You have 7 companies responsible for everything. In that conversation, in that environment, you can just have conversations. I reject anyone that wants to make appeals to the abstract in an environment where you have 7 miners and 1 implementation. We are centralized. We have Bitcoin Core and we have 7 miners on the planet. That's pretty much it. So as I was saying, you have Foundry, you have Antpool, which includes all of the small pools. You have Via BTC and F2Pool, and you have Mara. That's basically it. I can include Spider Pool as well, and then you have everything accounted for except for the bottom 2 or 3%, something like that. So that's 98% of what ends up in the blockchain is accounted for with those 6 or 7 companies. If you have a situation like I'm advocating for, where we start saying, forget about consensus, forget about what's the black and white lettering of your contract. I don't want to spend the next 8 months with lawyers figuring out exactly how to make you do exactly what I want, writing it in black and white. I just want to have a chat with you because this isn't working out quite right. That's what mempool policies do. We find a stricter rule set that adapts to however Bitcoin is being used now by people that want to use it for good things and people that want to use it to abuse the network. We find out who the abusers are, we look at what their current protocols are, and we adopt filters that say, we're not relaying this around the network. And then it's up to a miner. They can either go, I'm going to get around this, I'm going to work to rule and figure out a way that I can abide by the letter of the contract, but still assist in the undermining of the network. Or I can look at what these people clearly are pointing about what these people are clearly indicating with their filters, that they don't want this stuff in the chain, and I can go along with it. And what hurts so much is that good faith is the essence of how everything in mining works today. People assume, like, as I said, it's all cutthroat, everyone is going to compete and try and outdo everyone else. It's not how mining works. Everything in mining today is based on good faith. Bitmain can destroy the network in 1 minute. Everything is phoning home, everything's closed source, everything is backdoored. They just haven't. They run the biggest pool when you combine it with all the smaller pools, or you can say that Foundry run the biggest pool. Both of those guys are over 20% of the network. Once you're over that size, you can 51% attack and do disruption. Do they do it? No. And you can't just point to the fact that they're not motivated to do it. Why would they bite the hand that feeds them? It's because fundamentally people don't do, I don't want to swear too much on this channel, but people don't just walk down the road and go, hey, I could get away with murdering that guy. Kill. They don't do it just to be assholes. People do cooperate. People actually want to have nice things. People don't naturally do awful things. And that's evidenced by, more than anything else, mining pools being a thing. Mining pools on paper don't work because block withholding is a thing, which means that you can mine on a pool, you can enjoy the benefits of everyone else's rewards, and you can lose 1 share's worth of work. Every time you find a block, you just don't tell the pool about it, you throw it away. You can't do anything with it anyway. That 1 share is barely going to pay you anything, but now the entire pool is working to pay you when you're not an honest actor. You're undermining the entire pool, and pools can die in a day. If one person wants to do this, it's extremely hard to detect, because how can you prove that someone had a block that they never told you about? It's not a thing. Pooled mining has this fundamental Achilles heel. It's only fixable with a hard fork, and there's no real super attractive way to do it, even if the network was up for it. So how do pools exist today? Well, back in the early days, people said this isn't going to be a thing. Pooled mining can't work because of block withholding. You need to rely on everyone else on the pool being a good person. And people started attacking the first pools that came around with block withholding, trying to say, this shouldn't work, it's a stupid idea, and I'm going to prove it's a stupid idea. There were not enough of those people to actually make pooled mining fail as a concept. And now, with the exception of Mara, who is about 7% of the network, 6% of the network that I'm looking at right now, the remaining 93% of the network is all pooled mining. All of it. Which means we decided we don't care about people being dishonest. Not enough people are arseholes for that to matter. We'd much rather all cooperate, do something which doesn't work on paper, but actually is very practical. That is spam filters, and that is Bitcoin. That is everything about Bitcoin. Because the minute Satoshi showed up, everyone just said, this doesn't work on paper because you can't solve the Byzantine generals problem. And he said, I bet this just works anyway. And he was right. And that's why pooled mining just works anyway, even though anyone can lie and mess everything up. They just don't. People would just rather be honest about it. And there's so many negative incentives in there. Some of the firmware that you'd get for aftermarket firmware for ant miners is literally connected to rival pools. You think Brains OS, which is closed source, phones home, has a dev fee, you think they're not tempted to make it so that if you point your Brains OS miner at a pool that isn't Brains, to block withhold that pool, you think that incentive doesn't exist? It does. Why aren't they doing it? Because people just aren't actually assholes. That's why. So if you're in a situation where Core fix a filter because inscriptions are screwing everything up, if they fix that filter and over the course of 6 or 7 or 8 months, the network generally upgrades, inscriptions stop getting relayed around the network, and miners start building up tools like Slipstream to get them out of band anyway and start sticking them in the chain against the desires of the nodes, of the 85,000 nodes on the network that are indicating we don't want this. You think we're not going to sit down and have a conversation with the people responsible for that? I'm not talking about having these stupid jerk-off abstract discussions with core devs saying, if a miner this, if a miner that. It's bollocks. We can sit down with Foundry or Bitmain and say, stop putting this stuff in the blocks. We've had these kinds of conversations before, and we end up winning. That's what happens. Because that's the only rational way for us to really win this. And all of the arguments invoked, they just go into this, they zoom super out into abstract territory, talking about miners in an ethereal capacity. in which they do not occupy in reality, and talking about incentives and how people will undermine one another. Foundry have a motivation to redirect 4 or 5% of their hash rate to all of the smaller pools and block withhold them and kill them all. Foundry could do that in 5 minutes. Why don't they do that? Because they're not assholes. They don't want to get caught doing things like that, but it would be really hard to catch them if they did that. They could bankrupt all of those smaller pools in 5 minutes, and this is one of the most annoying things about my back and forth with Greg on Reddit. He keeps talking about the fact that if we filter stuff, miners can construct blocks that contain transactions we've never heard about because of our filtration being so effective that we don't even cache it. We don't learn about something and filter it, but cache it, and then we can reconstruct the block without any delay in propagation. No, he's talking about a scenario where like 70% of the network adopts a filter, and therefore a bunch of the network literally just never sees some kinds of transactions, these undesirable transactions. Okay, great. If we do that, he's saying, here's the problem. A miner like Foundry can solicit that transaction out of band, put it in a block, and then that block will propagate more slowly because it will be sent out as a compact block. Nodes will see the block and they won't be able to verify it because one of the transactions in it is unfamiliar to them. So they have to request it and then get it back, and then they can reconstruct and verify the block. And that cascading through the network adds time. Maybe it adds a second or two to that block making it around the network. In the theoretical scenarios that they're happy talking about with decentralized mining, where we can actually talk about miners in that kind of capacity, that is a problem for the miner if that happens. If you're 1% of the network, you have a 1% chance of finding the block after this block full of spam. And you don't want to put yourself at a greater disadvantage by running the risk of that initial spammy block getting orphaned by another block that gets found by another miner that didn't contain loads of spam and traveled around the network faster. It's only possible for that spammy block to become a problem for everyone else except the big miner if the miner is large enough that the miner can attack the network a bunch of other ways anyway that they just aren't doing because, again, they can't. You can't just attack Bitcoin directly, or you can't just assume everyone is going to act like that, because they demonstrably don't. So here's my point with all that. This argument I keep having with Greg, where he's saying, if we filter out stuff, when that stuff makes it into blocks, all the small miners suffer because the blocks from the biggest miner take longer to get around the network. So the big miner gets a head start every single race. And I keep retorting, if a miner is that big, we have to trust them not to 51% attack the network anyway. And even if we relay maximum amounts of trash all around the network to try and prevent this, they can still just create a transaction locally that's consensus and policy valid and stick it in the block without broadcasting anything to the network until they solve the block. Then it's exactly the same scenario, and we have no way to prevent that. So bending over backwards, relaying as much spam as possible to make block propagation faster in case a miner wants to be malicious doesn't work. Because if the miner wants to be malicious, they can be no matter what our relay policy is. I need this to be understood because this completely undermines Greg's argument. I've been going back and forth with him for almost 2 weeks now, and I see since pushing really hard on this point, he's just given up responding to me. And I see Mandrick out there yesterday saying, I don't have an opinion on this op return thing, but I know what Greg's opinion is, so now that's my opinion. And I see Shinobi praising him for it, saying, well done, this is the correct approach. And Greg is wrong. He's invoked endless arguments about why filtration will cause unforeseen consequences that further centralize mining and undermine fee estimation. And as I pointed out to Greg yesterday, are we just not talking about fee estimation anyway since I debunked that argument? No response. He even got back to me since then without mentioning that. Fee estimation was bullshit, guys. It was a rationalization for cowardice in service of us not standing up to spammers, trying to turn the Bitcoin network into a garbage dump. The fact that the users of the network, the people at the top of the pyramid, would sit there and say, we're not relaying this stuff anymore. And if our miners want to be recalcitrant and seek ways to discover it anyway without our assistance and put it in the chain anyway, we're going to need to come sit down and have a chat with you. If you get more decentralized, there's no one to talk to. And that's the scenario I keep invoking, and that's the one Ocean wants to create. Then if there's a bunch of spam in blocks, I don't have Foundry or Mara or Antpool or Via or Efterpool to go and talk to and say, can you stop doing this? We're going to go nuts. We're going to tank your share price. We don't have that anymore. But that's the scenario I want to live in. But in that case, then Greg loses his main argument anyway, because all the miners become so much more tiny that they're not likely to build on top of their own block because there's thousands of them at this point. Mara itself is only 6%. Mara needs to charge more for Slipstream because when it includes a bunch of junk in its blocks that were unknown to everyone's mempools, it runs a higher risk of getting orphaned. It only becomes an advantage to Mara to try and delay its propagation of its own blocks around the network if it has a really good chance of building on top of its own block. And it doesn't, because it's only 6.5% of the network. You need to be much bigger than that. And here's my point, to reiterate. When you get much bigger than that, you get above 20%, you start to be able to ruin everything else with that size. So filtration is not something that poses any real risk, because the scenarios in which it can hurt us are scenarios in which we are screwed anyway, unless we are prepared to take the fact that miners generally are operating in good faith. And this is what really annoys me, because it's cowardly. We have a situation where you have a boardroom, you have a bunch of high-level people in a company, and you have their security staff, who are the miners in this case, who are not doing what we want, but we're not even prepared to indicate to them that they should stop doing it in case they say no and start finding other ways around it. That's no good. That's a breakdown in communication, and that's not a healthy network dynamic. And here's the part that really frustrates me, because until we indicate things, I can't even say any of the miners are doing anything wrong. Like I said, Mara is, because Mara is already going outside of what gets relayed around the network to try and fill it up with trash. And rather than have a go at them about that, like we did with OFAC compliance, we're just saying, oh, we need to adjust mempool policies. We need to relax them to prevent them from going out of band, which they can always do anyway. If you're big enough, you can sell block space out of band. Commoditization of block space is happening. Big miners are the people that are going to be able to make disproportionate use of that. If you want to deal with that problem, let me know. But breaking up Foundry, and the only way really to do it is to get actual hashers to say to the giant pools, we want to be able to make our own blocks and we want our nodes to be relevant. That's how you fix everything in Bitcoin. And that's not even part of the discussion here. And this is what I'm saying about breaking mining up into small, Foundry needs to become 1,000 different pools, which is just all of the miners on that pool making their own blocks. When you do that, network relay policy standardness becomes king again. Because if we're not relaying stuff around the network and you want to include it in your blocks, all you're doing is increasing your risk of that block being orphaned. And who's really going to pay you all that much to do this anyway? Because it's going to take you a day to find a block anyway. It's not going to be the next 10 minutes. If I want all of the miners on the network able to add it into their block, I better just fit within the relay policies of the network. I better actually make a Bitcoin transaction rather than store a JPEG. And if I want to store a JPEG, use another blockchain or hash it and store it in 32 bytes of op return. That works absolutely fine. So it means the spammers have to adapt and the miners have to respect what the boss of the network is actually talking about. So when everyone talks about it being completely foregone conclusion that this is impossible, there's nothing we can do, incentives dictate behavior and miners are going to want to earn money, and if we don't relay all their crap around the network on their behalf, they're going to root around us, and then small miners will suffer, so mining will get even more centralized and our fee estimation will be bad. Are you starting to understand the gaslighting that's going on here? Now I want you to go and watch Matthew Crater's video where he talks about the old culture in Bitcoin Core, where they espoused everything I'm talking about here. They had the priorities the other way up. They were happy with things being node dominant. Here are the new rules. This is compact blocks. Miners are advised, this was 2016, miners are advised to update the new policies to reduce the risk of their blocks being orphaned. It's miners' problems if they don't want to respect spam filters. It's not our problem if they don't. All we are concerned about is coming up with solutions that we can move around on a temporary basis to dictate and guide the behavior and indicate to the miners what it is we actually want without having to rewrite the freaking contract every time something goes wrong. If I employ someone and he's supposed to bring me coffee at 10:30 in the morning or something, and 10:30 passes and it's 11 o'clock and I still want my coffee and he says, no, it's not 10:30 anymore, then I'm going to be like, look, I don't want to sit you down and rewrite this contract. I just want you to figure it out. And that's what relay policy does. It says, all right, there's a bunch of new malicious activity. It's big enough now that it warrants us coming up with a new mempool filter. Inscriptions is the perfect example of that. 88% of Taproot outputs are dust, which means they are being used for something nothing to do with money. And the insult to all of this is that SegWit and Taproot were supposed to reduce on-chain bloat. They were supposed to mean that you could do way more with the same amount. And instead, the opposite has happened. The witness discount that was supposed to incentivize shrinking the UTXO set is being used by inscriptions, which tripled the size of the UTXO set in 2 years. It's completely fallen on its arse. When you go back and look at all the rationale and all the academic discussion about SegWit and Taproot, look at the stated objectives of all this stuff and see how we have failed. We blew up the UTXO set when the witness discount was supposed to shrink it. And Taproot was supposed to mean you could, it's not exactly masked, but it's supposed to mean that you can prevent a whole bunch of unnecessary stuff ending up on chain because you only have one path getting executed, which means you can do so much with Taproot without causing an egregious amount of space to be used up on the chain. And instead, 88% of what Taproot's being used for is dust outputs in service of inscriptions. So it failed, and now we look like idiots because every time we try and come up with a fantastic upgrade, this is going to mean Lightning, and this is going to mean Schnorr signatures, and this is going to mean that we use less space with a cooperative close of Lightning channels. All of these wonderful things that we're supposed to get from these upgrades, and all we did was end up trashing Bitcoin completely. And to make it, what really hurts is that we cannot clean up our mess. The fact that inscriptions became possible due to a bug in Taproot that then we got too gaslit to allow ourselves to fix is just an embarrassing stain on the entire history of this project. Because go back, like I said, back in 2016, we're saying we have new mempool policies. Miners, you need to adopt these for your own good. That got flipped on its head, and now Core and Greg and every one of their apologists is saying it's on nodes to adapt their policies around what miners are doing, which is completely upside down. Why are the executive boardroom people tying themselves in knots, coming in at 3 a.m. because that's when the security staff decided they want to start protecting the building, and they're all going home at 9 in the morning because they have a side gig. They can earn more money at night doing something else at the same time. Not our problem, but we're tying ourselves in knots. Sorry, babe, I've got to go to work. It's 3 a.m. Why are you going to work at 3 a.m.? Because we don't have security staff in the building any other time. They don't want to do it then. I'm sorry, do they run your company? No, they don't. Have you even tried sitting down with them and saying, guys, we're not going to do this anymore? No, we haven't, because they might say no. This is the gutlessness of what's going on. Indicate to the miners that we don't want this stuff in the chain, so we at least can turn around to them and say, hey, Foundry and Antpool, why are you putting inscriptions in the chain? We're telling you we don't want this. At the moment, we're not even gutsy enough to do that because we're too scared that they will go around the backs of the node and put it in the chain anyway. And apparently that will break everything. It won't do any harm. It will just mean, okay, rather than it being Core that are bad actors and making it so that we relay all this malicious activity, at least the nodes are doing what's incentive compatible for them. And now we can go to the miners who are lower down in the food chain than us and say, you guys need to pay attention to this. Why are you disrespecting the filters and putting all this crap in the chain? Unless we can set a precedent where we're in charge and miners aren't, and that we have a way of responding quickly to threats, to people finding holes in the contract where they can do technically what's written there, i.e. valid by consensus, but do stuff which harms the network anyway. If we don't continue along the precedent of saying that this stuff needs to be treated with hostility like we always did, and everyone needs to fall in line pretty quick, why not? If we don't do that, we're just going to turn Bitcoin into every other crypto. We don't take our problems seriously. We just get needlessly abstract. This is how people talk about crypto. They just say, oh, it's decentralized. No one can control it. And it's been our job as toxic maximalists for 10 years to say, that's nonsense, not in practice. Because look at what is actually happening. Look at how the Ethereum Foundation has just decided, well, this is actually going to be how things work going forward. Why pretend you're decentralized when you're not? Why pretend that your network has characteristics that you can't fight against when you actually can? Is it because you want to scam people? In crypto, yes. Is it in Bitcoin? In Bitcoin, that is not the reason. In Bitcoin, the reason we play these silly games and we make appeals to abstracts that don't really exist because we only have 7 miners. We don't need to talk about miners in the abstract. If that being the case, in here it's just in service of cowardice. That's all it is. And if anyone was prepared to grow a pair inside the Bitcoin intelligentsia and say, yeah, of course we filter this stuff, is an exploit. That's not why Taproot's here. Taproot isn't here to enable inscriptions. People storing JPEGs in the chain and having that stuff be relayed around the network for free to miners at the expense of nodes is a mistake, and that needs to be fixed. This is an exploit. This is a bug. Fix it. The fact that they went to philosophical territory and went, well, it's all valid at the consensus level, was a complete betrayal of Bitcoin's principles and everything about it betrays every precedent set since the op return wars. So go and watch Matthew Cratter's video, look at the history of it, understand why the same people even back then were talking in very different language and were prepared to put up a fight and to push these people out of the ecosystem, as opposed to today where they sponsor all the big conferences and they're just slowly eating away at Bitcoin's culture to the point where it's just going to become another crypto because no one cares about nodes. This is the only difference between Bitcoin and crypto, is that Bitcoin has this maniacal focus that nodes matter and that everyone needs to be able to run one and that they must be at the top of the food chain. All we're doing at the moment, all Core are doing is completely betraying that principle by saying, no, miners are at the top of the food chain and the spammers that want to pay them. Nodes have to bend over and take it. Otherwise, bad things happen that are all complete lies that have been debunked one by one that we're just pretending never happened. This is happening. You guys are living in a fantasy land. You can't stop spam, yada, yada, yada. I saw a big op return in the chain, and I've made, how many times do I need to make that clear? That, that stupid argument. Asians are shorter on average than Caucasians. Well, I saw a tall Japanese guy. Is that, like Greg even went to that point, making that stupid argument that here's a big op return, your argument fails. Antoine starts his whole podcast with Stefan Lavara making exactly the same fallacy. They think they can stop spam. They can't. They can only limit it. Ridiculous lies, guys. Why are Bitcoin Core telling lies and constructing these stupid straw man? Not in the last 2 years of history has anyone ever from my side pretended that you can completely stop spam. We just don't care about it until it reaches a big enough point that it becomes a problem, like inscriptions, and then you can filter it trivially because then that ecosystem that you're fighting has its own inertia, and you can use its size against it. If there's 3 guys that want to spam the chain, yeah, they will actually run out of money at some point. And yeah, they can be nimble and agile and get around new filters, but they also can't do that much damage. However, if there's tens of millions of dollars being thrown at companies like the Taproot wizards to come up with ways to mess with Bitcoin, that's big. That takes a while for people to root around, and that's why it's so easy to defeat it. And this is why it's so annoying that we have defeatism when it comes to any sort of countermeasure we might put in. Because those ecosystems adapting is a pain in the butt. You have to deal with thousands of people. So there's every reason to take it on. When you're faced with a Goliath, you can deal with the fact that they move slowly because they're giant. And you can say, all right, we're going to start filtering inscriptions as we find them today. It's going to take months for it to become a thing, but then that whole ecosystem is going to have to adapt, or they're going to have to start again. I'm up for that fight. The cat and mouse game is so worth it. But what no one can deal with is talking outsides of blacks and whites. Well, the minute you get into black and white territory, well, you can never completely stop it, so do nothing. I'm appalled that argument is still on the table. I mean, Greg, to be fair to him, hasn't been around on Twitter for the last 2 years, so he hasn't really seen that much of it. But the conversation has moved on. No one in their right mind is pretending you can prevent all arbitrary data on Bitcoin. All of the advocates for this are running knots, which defaults to 40 bytes. So we're totally accepting some level of compromise here. We're just saying we're not doing any more than that. And that's the best you're going to get out of us spammers and miners. And we're the reason this network has any sort of unique value to it. That's the end of it. Nodes matter, and nodes are the boss of this network. And they don't have to assert themselves merely through consensus rules. And that's what mistake everyone is making here. They can signal that they don't like a certain kind of activity through spam filters because those are much easier to change, much quicker. And then it's up to miners to respect them, and they'll get punished if they don't. They will have slower block propagation. And that's their problem. That's not the network's problem. And yeah, if they want to seek out alternative ways to put this stuff in the chain, they can do it, but who's really going to pay for it in a decentralized mining environment where you have to wait a whole day for a block to be found? And that's only if you have a guy with, 3 exahash, or actually more like, you need a guy with 6 exahash that you've got to communicate with out of band to put your junk in the chain if you want to have a chance of getting it in the next 24 hours. That's no good. I think these people are just going to say, I need it in the chain in 10 minutes. I better just actually use Bitcoin the way the nodes are telling me to. So, yeah, I mean, it all comes down to that working to rule thing. Everyone wants to say Bitcoin miners are just going to work to rule. If we try and ask them to do anything that isn't in the physical contract, the black and white rules of it, they just won't do it. And I'm like, well, then we don't have very good employees, do we? And I just don't buy it. There is way too much goodwill here. There is way too much good faith operating inside this space. If we have an adversarial mindset against people that are demonstrably only doing what is in the network's best interest, as far as their understanding goes, then we're giving up and we're throwing in the towel on having a decent conversation before we've even had the guts to start it. You start with the spam filters. At that point, you're telling the miners finally, hey, we don't like this stuff. Inscriptions are doing a lot of damage. We want to get rid of them. If they carry on, then it's on them. Okay, we're going to build, every single mining pool is going to build its version of Slipstream. If and when they do that, there needs to be consequences for that. Does that mean you go nuclear and start a fork? No, it doesn't, because there's only 6 or 7 of them in the world to deal with anyway. We will deal with it the same way we did when Mara started doing OFAC compliance. And we will get them to stop. Have some courage, do what's right for the network, make it work, and don't worry about all this FUD. And go watch Matthew Crater's video. Thank you.